Okay, welcome everybody to Vit Now session on reducing vineyard costs in a difficult market. This was a topic that we held off addressing for most of this winter just because of the sensitivity of the topic and just a lot of uncertainty. And it came to our awareness in the last several weeks that really we needed to tackle this before we got into the growing season, with a lot of questions coming in through extension, a lot of discussion happening between meetings, never in the meetings. And we recognized as a viticulture extension team that we really ought to bring some people together to discuss this topic. So over the next hour or so, we're not going to go over the hour. We're going to cut this off probably at 10 till the hour. We're going to discuss what are the possibilities. And to start out with, I just want to introduce our panel, and I'll start with myself. I'm Patty Skinkis. I'm Viticulture Extension Specialist and Professor based on main campus in Corvallis at Oregon State University. I have my extension and research colleague, Alec Levin. You're up next to introduce yourself.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Patty. Good to see everyone. Alec Levin, Viticulturist Associate Professor at OSU, also Director of the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center.
All right. Thank you, Alec. Achala.
Hello, everyone. I'm Achala KC. I'm also at the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center, and my research focus on diseases of wine grapes and pears here at the Southern Oregon. And I'm affiliated with the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology.
Thank you, Achala. Walt.
Walt Mahaffee, research plant pathologist with USDA Agricultural Research Service, also the acting RL for the Horticultural Crops Disease and Pest Management Unit in Corvallis, and courtesy faculty with Oregon State University.
All right, thank you, Walt. James Stearns.
I'm one of the two Jameses. I'm James Stearns. I'm an applied economist in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University. My office here is in Corvallis, and look at the marketing and the economic side of the wine industry is kind of my focus.
All right, thank you, James. And James Osborne.
Hello, I'm the other James. I'm professor and statewide Enology extension specialist in the food science department, and also the director of the Oregon Wine Research Institute.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming together so quickly to address this. And it's a very hot topic. I suspect we'll have more participants join us as we go along today. But in the meantime, I want to give some ground rules for this meeting. This is a typical meeting on Zoom, so you would have the ability to turn on your audio and your video if you would like to chime in with a comment or consideration or question. However, you may also use the chat or the Q&A feature. You can use the chat. I think most people are familiar with how to do that if you're on a mobile device or on your computer, to type in your question for the panelists or a comment. But we also have the Q&A feature, and that's usually where you can ask a question anonymously if you so choose to. And of course, you can always just address the question verbally if you'd like to. Maybe raise your hand first and we can try to moderate that. I have Abigail Schrerum online as well, who is a research assistant who will keep track of both the Q&A and the chat box and anybody who raises their hand and would like to speak. But to get started, I wanted to jump in with a few questions for you. So hopefully you're seeing on your screen a question about where you're joining us from today. So this can be the city, state, or if you're in a different country, you can put in the country. Just scan that QR code or type in that numerical code to answer this question. And it should be, once people start voting, that'll pop up. So we'll know who we're talking to. And just based on the registration that I saw come through, most of the participants are here in Oregon, but there are some from also the USDA, from outside of Oregon. I think most of them are from the Risk Management Agency who had registered as well. So we've got some friends from afar. Okay. All right, so we have mostly individuals from Oregon. So it should take you to the next question. I'm going to just move us along. What percentage of your acreage is contracted for 2025? So if you sell fruit or you grow fruit and you're going through, at least at this point in the year, how much is contracted? So you just give a percentage to that. So we have a sense for what people are dealing with. Okay, we have a few more people still voting. Okay, so quite a few people, the majority have more than 50% of their acreage not contracted. Okay, so next question. Do you have contracted and non-contracted areas in your same vineyard for this year? And this is a question that will really help us understand when it comes to disease management and some of the other management practices for this growing season. Okay, so at least for now, it looks like the majority does have contracted and non-contracted areas in the same vineyard. So that produces some challenges. Next one has to do with crop insurance coverage. Do you have crop insurance coverage for your non-contracted areas this year? Yes, no, or unsure? Okay, so about 50-50 split for how many have crop insurance coverage already for that area. Okay, just went up a little bit more of its contract. Okay, so we're higher on the yes for crop insurance coverage for non-crop contracted areas. So hopefully that's helpful in some regards for some of the panelists. And a number of people in preparation for this said they just wanted to see also what other people are dealing with. So hopefully this poll is helpful to you as well, those participating out there. Okay, so up next, what the plan is I'm going to give you a break on doing some of these polls for a little bit. And we're going to talk about some frequently asked questions. So there's certain questions that came through to us, and then we'll go through those. We won't cover all of them, and then we'll cover some vineyard cost reduction practices. So of the frequently asked questions, there's a number of them that came in, and a lot of people asking, can we fallow a vineyard, or can a vineyard be fallowed? And what management practices should be reduced? These are the top two questions. And so we would like to address those, and all of my colleagues who are online, please feel free to jump in as I cover some of this. And those of you online, if you have any questions for clarification. And then there's additional questions we had. What should be done if there's not a contract for years? What minimal spray programs should be used? How do these cost reduction practices affect crop insurance? And when will the market correct? And I think the hardest one of all of these is probably number 6. When will the market correct? Because none of us has a crystal ball, at least at this point. So let's start with the first one. Can a vineyard be fallowed? And some considerations in our response, or at least my response at this stage, is that what does the word fallow mean? Typically, it means do nothing. So do nothing to a vineyard. The biggest challenge with this is that grapevines are a perennial crop. You have to manage them. You can't just walk away and do something else with those vines. A lot of people discuss, well, what happens if I want to come back? And the problem is that it's just going to be a high cost to come back into a vineyard if you do nothing. So you have a significant cost to bring it back to commercial viability. And that could be disease related, could just be just sheer pruning and fruitability over time. And also the concern that you're going to have a high pest pressure with this current season, both within your own vineyards and neighboring vineyards, so in vineyards in the area. So I'm going to stop here and want to invite my colleagues to jump in. I know Walt Mahaffee wrote a nice piece for our OWRI Vine to Wine newsletter in January, I think it was, forecasting what people could do relative to a potentially higher amount of acreage not being sprayed. So if we actually reduce spray programs or do nothing. So Walt, do you have any comments or Achala from a disease management perspective?
The main thing to think about if you fallow a vineyard is the disease pressure will get worse year after year. So because where grape powdery mildew can overwinter in buds, and that is where we see the most disease pressure is when we have overwintering infected buds. So if you leave it fallow, there's a high proportion of the buds that are likely infected the following spring, and the disease pressure will be worse. It'll impact further afield. And so far more than just your vineyard a lot earlier in the growing season than the first year. The first year, it might look like you get away with it. Probably not. In most of the areas, you'll start to see it by the time bloom comes. But it will be even worse the following year. And trunk disease, it would be a whole nother problem.
Yeah, and also, yeah, most of the diseases, the common ones probably, will have increased pressure, but like vines and the plants act as, if they are under stress, then there are the chances that other opportunistic pathogens take over. So yeah, I think the best way would be to minimize the stress to the plants as much as possible.
Is there anybody online that has been planning to do a complete fallow that would like to address or ask any questions? So remember, everybody has the ability to jump in on this one. If you prefer not to speak and just type in the chat or the Q&A, that's acceptable too. But we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. At least at this point, whenever there were individuals asking about fallowing, the next question became how many years you think you might be wanting to fallow. And the consideration, and it's a hard consideration, is ripping out the vineyard. And if you're not going to have a market for it longer term than just the season, that's what the recommendation would be, that you're not creating more problems for yourself, your operation. This is also what's been coming across longer term for the California wine industry, and this has been for years. They've been recommending removals of subperforming blocks or vineyards. And I know that there are some people who have made that hard decision. There seems to be a lot of people not very still emotionally tied to plantings, especially small, very, very small operations. But the reality is that if you're not going to have a place for your fruit for a long time, you may have to consider that, because the cost of returning it to commercial viability is going to be a significant burden. And we see that periodically in extension questions that come through where somebody has just adopted or bought out a vineyard and had not been managed well for years. Right. And it's just a very difficult row to hoe for the years to come. So that's something to consider. Okay, see some comments in the chat. Okay, so some other Some other considerations. So most people have been turning to reduced management practices and have put out some questions about what could work. And I've met with some people individually and talked with them about this. And the best thing that we can provide is some context. So things that for people to think about. Consideration is how many years are you targeting reduction practices? So this is not talking about fallow anymore. We're going into the part where you're going to maintain your vineyard, but how can you reduce your costs? And are you planning to not have a home for it for just this year or multiple years? Also, what is the current vine vigor level? So if you've got really weak vines and they're diseased and phylloxerated, do you want, how much longer can they take more stressors on them? So not doing as much management will lead to more stress, whether it's not using herbicide or not tilling or having more weed pressure, so less water available, less nutrient availability, just things that add up beyond just the nutrient, just not beyond the disease management aspects. Also, is your vineyard irrigated? Are there plans to reduce the irrigation to a point that, could be at a severe disadvantage for bringing these vines back? Obviously, if you're using it as a late season supplement and you probably could get by without it, you could use it to your advantage to manipulate canopy size. It's like here in the Willamette Valley, we don't have that luxury, but in other parts of the state, that might be a way to manage canopy size and reduce production costs. Some other considerations: do you have major pest concerns? So are there areas that have trunk disease, or you've got areas that have phylloxera, like I mentioned earlier, that you might want to consider removing if they're still own rooted? And do you have to manage certain areas more just because you do have a pest epicenter that you want to make sure that it's not going to spread to the rest of your vineyards? How close are your neighboring vineyards, whether it's your own, where you have production slated for this year, where you've got fruit contracted, and or just your neighbors that you don't want to jeopardize their ability to produce a viable crop. And then do you have crop insurance? Now, this one was a question that certainly is not in my wheelhouse, but James Stearns, I'm hopeful that you might be able to have some answers on this. And I noticed a number of people from the USDA RMA joined or at least signed up and registered for this webinar. So maybe they have some insight into this. But one of the questions that came up was related to not only your own management on a farm, but also your neighboring vineyards. What happens if you have crop insurance, you do everything in your power to save your crop, and you still get decimated with powdery mildew because you have a neighbor that wasn't controlling theirs? Does that allow for crop insurance? That's a very likely scenario. It's not a force of nature that led to the demise of the vineyard, but it is a reality that could impact growers this year. So I don't know, James, if you have any comments towards that end or any other comments relative to crop insurance and making claims on that relative to reducing vineyard management costs.
Well, I would caution everybody to consult with the people they're purchasing crop insurance from and not rely on what I'm about to say. As a general consideration, I mean, crop insurance is always contingent upon that you've done your best to manage your vineyards appropriately. Failure to show good management practices does disqualify you as a general condition of crop insurance. So that's a conversation to have. I know of some past precedents concerning what happens when a neighbor doesn't do their best effort to manage their vineyard. And I honestly do not remember how those issues were resolved. Perhaps the folks from USDA can chime in if they're online. The other thing to consider is to have conversations about crop insurance in terms of, what's the minimum could we do and to maintain eligibility and a continuity of participation in the program. And if we're looking at reducing our costs and some of the intensity of our management, then catastrophic insurance might be an option where they only subscribe to cat insurance as a way to lower the overall cost burden of having crop insurance without exiting the program. So those are some initial thoughts. And again, I think that what this whole slide suggests is that it's worthwhile having a good conversation with the person that you may be or have historically purchased crop insurance from.
Okay.
Something to think about in terms of disease management to give people a frame of reference is going back to 2015, 2016, when fungicide resistance cropped up and we had vineyards that all of a sudden became a heavy inoculum source for neighboring blocks or neighboring vineyards, and the difficulty that people had in managing mildew during that time period. We're likely to see that on steroids with the number of acreage or the amount of acreage that is likely to see reduced management. And then in terms of helping reduce mildew development, anything that creates a water stress that reduces vine growth is going to reduce leaf susceptibility to powdery mildew. So getting the vine to grow slower, the leaves to harden off faster will help. Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, areas that we do irrigate to keep the vine going, this will be readily managed. In the Willamette Valley, it'll be rather difficult.
Mm-hmm. So I do see a question in the Q&A, and this is getting into management practices. So this is great. And if you do have questions and you want to remain anonymous, you can use the Q&A to type in the question. So one of the questions, and this is getting right into our vineyard cost reduction topic, is how about just two budding the fruiting cane instead of a full cane? And I think that's assuming instead of laying down a cane and cane pruning, you're just pruning back to the head and leaving the renewal spurs essentially in a cane prune vine. That, if I'm not correct in that interpretation, basically that's what a lot of people asked me about this winter was during pruning practices to basically cut back to the head, not cutting the head off, but leaving spurs at the head. So head pruning and doing that instead of doing the full cane pruning. And depending on where you are in the state, we advised against it only because it can lead to super high vigor. So if you come through and you do just two budding the head, not doing cane pruning, you've now reduced your bud number to maybe 4 buds total instead of maybe 20 buds. And you're going to get a huge amount of vigor that's still going to need to be managed. You might not have fruit. You might still have some fruit. So thinking more holistically about what your vines would look like, not only this season, but into next season and how you're going to manage that vigor. Unfortunately, depending on where you're located, especially here in the Willamette Valley, if you can prune back, but you're still going to get a lot of growth. And what's that growth going to look like and how are you going to maintain that relative to the disease? So that's something to consider. Also, another question that came in for Walt, are you recommending to irrigate minimally so that the vines lignify sooner?
That's what what would reduce powdery mildew susceptibility faster, is getting the vines under water stress as soon as possible, because then your bud number, your leaves will stay smaller, they'll harden off quicker, you'll have fewer nodes developing, and all of that would reduce mildew and help you then subsequently reduce the number of fungicide applications required to keep mildew manageable in your blocks that you do have contracted. You're still gonna have to spray any type of vineyard that is going to reduced inputs.
So one question is, could they spray crop oil only throughout the season, excluding hot days, and use of sulfur?
I would not consider oil suitable for this because it has little or no protection. Sulfur, you could probably stretch your intervals because you're not worried as much about the berry incidents in this and still manage to keep the vineyard producing lower levels of inoculum that doesn't significantly impact your surrounding vineyards. But you would still need to use sulfur, particularly during those periods of time where the vine is going to grow rapidly.
Yeah, so basically from bud break through to mid-July.
Yeah, and Patty, I would also like to add that if you are in the areas with high botrytis pressure, then probably, like neither sulfur nor oil is going to work. So yeah, we'll have to consider that aspect as well, especially during the heavy, the most susceptible phase, which is like flowering period.
Okay, so we're talking about some vineyard cost reduction practices. Before we get too much further, I want to ask what practice you plan to use this spring. And you can add those in. This will be anonymously shared. So any practices you plan to use this spring that kind of deviate from normal? So you'll scan the QR code on the screen if you have a screen, and then that'll show up what others are using. So using the hedger more to keep canopies small. Reduce shoot positioning, so that's a huge cost savings. Pruning, leafing vines. Reduce irrigation. Everything normal until fruit thinning. Removing acreage. Skipping sprays and stretching intervals. Leaving less canes and buds. So the question about the pruning and leaving less canes and buds, I think, is something that makes some sense. But for those in areas where you have high vine vigor, you're still going to have a lot of growth. So we're coming into the season. It's pretty wet already. We'll see what April and May brings us. But at least in the Willamette Valley, just recognize that you might have a bit more work than normal, or just about the same amount of work. If you're reducing your amount of buds, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to reduce your vigor. It might mean that what comes out is going to be super vigorous. So I see the number one thing, and so this was ranking it based on everything else, is reduce shoot positioning. So VSP canopies, not raising catch wires, that'll be probably raising up maybe one catch wire. I'm going to interpret that as, because I think based on your vine spacing, if you have wide spacing, reducing your shoot positioning and not bringing up the catch wires, it'll be just fine. But if you're really narrow canopies, it's going to be difficult. So just keep in mind that the way you position your canopies and your way you do your canopy management is going to influence your disease as well. So I know Walt and Walt's newsletter article had mentioned that you can do your sprays, but reduce your sprays, but then you have to increase your canopy management. And they basically go hand in hand. If you want to skip sprays and stretch your intervals, you probably want to do some heavier canopy management. So maybe that's where the hedger aggression came in. So these are all, ways to consider reducing costs. I would say for the number one thing, reduce costs where you don't need to have costs. I know in vineyards, we tend to want to do way more than we need to in some cases. Less mowing is a good example, I think, for, doing things that really are more aesthetic rather than actually doing much for the grapevines. But you're still going to have a lot of costs. Unfortunately, with VSP canopies, you can not do, shoot positioning or reduce shoot thinning, but you're still going to have a lot of issues with canopy density that'll have to be addressed. So do any of you plan to try something new or to experiment with something? There's some people that had said they wanted to do hormone sprays to reduce the canopy size. And unfortunately, the biggest problem with hormone sprays is their sheer expense and just overdoing it with respect to maybe having a longer term effect than initially planned. So we see that about majority is say, yes, they're going to do something new. I know in terms of going back a little bit to the pruning season, I noticed there's more people who went to spur pruning instead of cane pruning this year, just to help reduce production costs as early as they could, but still maintaining traditional bud numbers or maybe even a little higher bud numbers or lower depending on their target, even if they don't have the fruit sold, just to try to maintain some reduced cost. So are there anybody who want to share any unique experiments that they're trying this year? You can type that in the Q&A or in the chat box. And while you do that, I see there's another question that came in. Can you reduce disbudding? I imagine you would still want a clean head to some degree, but not disbud the canes. So I think referring to shoot thinning early season, if you're in vigorous areas, you can get a high amount of secondary and tertiary buds or double buds growing at each node. And so if you're cane pruned, you can do shoot thinning, or even if you are spur pruning, you're going to get a lot more areas along the cordon you might need to thin. Just keep in mind that if you thin the heads, it's kind of that, I mean, that's a dense area. So no matter where you are in that plant, the pathogens are going to find that those dense areas and create a problem. So just disbudding at the head might not save you a lot, in terms of the disease component. And if you're going to send a labor crew through, it's just what attention of detail you want to give to those crews, I suppose, if it's down to reducing costs. Hopefully that makes sense, because you're going to have things growing at the head of the vine. There's usually in cane pruning less shoots you have to thin out compared to cordon trained spur pruned. Let's see. So comment, I think this is a comment more than a question. Reducing buds will increase vigor. Let's see. But will also let us reduce cultivation and irrigation. This happens when you drop top graft vines, huge amount of vigor through 4 buds, lots of growth, some mildew, but then you're back into production in a year if you desire. Okay, so there's more of a comment. That's true. If you do reduce your buds, it would be more vigorous, but you will be okay. Question, what percentage of Oregon acres in the ground need to come out to balance the market? And Alec, I think that's right. It's $1 million question. We don't have a sense for that as much here in in Oregon as compared to California because of how they do their crush reports. But I'll hand this over to James Stearns.
Well, I think that there's more to the question than just supply control. I think it's both a supply issue and a demand issue. So we could pull a lot of acreage out and only pull a lot of acreage out and ultimately get to the point where Oregon doesn't have very much acreage anymore and we still have an oversupply issue because it's just not Oregon also. Yeah, when I think about this, what are we going to do about this market correction? I really think of I try to envision a 2x2 matrix. So on the y-axis on the left-hand side, kind of think about demand and think about supply, and then on the x-axis going left to right, what can we do as an individual wine grape grower, or what can we do as an individual winery, and then what can we do as an industry? So there's really 4 cells in that 2x2 matrix, and what can I do individually to affect demand? What can I do individually to affect supply? What can we do as an industry to affect demand, and what can we do as an industry to affect supply? And so, those really answering those 4 questions, I think gives us a little more focus, and there's a little more clarity on some of those questions than there are other ones. I think, thinking in your own, situation, what can I do to increase demand for my product? That's gets back to who have you been selling wine grapes to, and who might you sell wine grapes to, and how might you find new outlets for your crop? But also if we think in terms of what can Oregon do as an industry to counter losses in demand or fading demand or demographic changes or whatever, all the different drivers that are affecting the demand challenges. I know this sounds like a really long answer to say nothing. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. I don't have a countdown to correction is completed, but I do think that we can either act passively or we can try to proactively engage. And again, I think there's 4 touch points that we can do that. I don't know what the industry can do collectively to affect supply, but there's a whole lot of issues that I think you can do individually as a grower or as a winery. So there's some individual choices that in the aggregate will help out the industry. So I'm open to more questions and comment, but that's kind of where I would start the conversation is make sure that we're talking about both demand and supply, and we're also taking into consideration what we can do individually and what we can do as an industry.
And I think that's part of the challenge with the Oregon industry is that it's so diverse, and how decisions, I've heard people say this for years, and they know of new plantings going in. They're like, who's putting in these new acreage? The people who have more of the pulse on what's actually going on in Oregon are, not necessarily the people planting, and the people planting coming in are coming from diverse areas, whether it's small to large investment operations, and it's not always been clear to pinpoint who's doing the expansions. I know there's a lot of concern out there too with the news that 2 large nurseries are no longer supporting the grape industry. They've chosen not to sell grapevines, and I think that's for the foreseeable future. And that is sending some shockwaves to making people think this is going to be longer term than just, the next year or so. See a couple other questions. Yeah, and that's correct. In California, they've been recommending removal for a number of years now at the annual meeting down in Sacramento, and something like 3 to 5% removal for California. We don't have anything like that here in Oregon. We're just a completely different market and structure of our industry. But yeah, that's the biggest question. We don't know. And people have been asking, well, how long is this going to last? I'm a viticulturist. I have no idea how long this is going to last. I want to pass it over to James Osborne to share anything that you see from the winery perspectives in terms of, how many have you heard from wineries about concern or lack of willingness to buy, given the amount of inventory or what they see on the horizon?
I don't think So specifically, I think it's a similar kind of hesitancy. You know, I think nobody really knows. There's a lot of uncertainty still in the short and long term from wine demands and inventories on stock. So yeah, I think there's still there's just a lot of uncertainty in the market, and so that I think uncertainty on just longer term planning on what that demand might be. So it's kind of a little bit of holding off and trying to see where things shake out a little bit, but nobody really has a firm idea on where that's heading. So yeah, unfortunately, no really firm plans or understanding of things, because I think there's just so much uncertainty in the market still, and there's lots of ideas and lots of avenues to explore on the supply, you know, increasing the demand side of things, but with when and where those will come to fruition, I think that's the unknown.
Thanks, James. I think that's what makes everybody nervous, is the unknown. So I think this is a great question and came in from the Q&A. Has anyone asked us about alternatives for removing fruit if the fruit is known that it won't be sold? For example, doing something crazy like running the leafer at bloom in the fruit zone to try to take out clusters, or what effects do you think this might have? Okay, so this person's asking about early season leafing to remove the fruit and getting, what it can do is if you do pretty extensive canopy manipulation, it could potentially reduce two things. If you use a hedger, you could cut the clusters off if you use it really aggressively. Also a leaf puller, or if you're the plucking type, could pull the clusters off. But if you use the compressed air type, or even just do a really extensive job of removing leaves, you can reduce fruit set. Now, studies we've done where we use it, you know, within reason, you can reduce the fruit set by about 20%, and that's done kind of the pre-bloom time period. But if you're looking to actually reduce your clusters, I think there's something bigger that needs to be considered there. So, and a lot of questions that came up over the last few months have been focused on, I don't need the fruit, therefore I should get rid of it. And as though the fruit is the only thing that matters for disease control. And even if you don't have the fruit on your plant, your plant is going to get powdery mildew. It's going to have a lot of inoculum, and Walt can verify or deny. You're going to have a lot, whether your clusters are on there or not, will not change your amount of disease present. Is that correct, Walt?
Clusters are a minor part of the epidemic. And honestly, for a lot of this, if you're not protecting it, you won't really have clusters. The inflorescence will be taken out before you get too much fruit. Honestly, something I've wondered is if we could use potentially a herbicide like AIM or carfentrazone ethyl to actually help manage some of this. But I have no idea what it would do, and it would be off-label, but I don't know if it's possible to get an emergency registration for it. But this is a herbicide that only kills what it touches. So if a small droplet hits a leaf, only that area is killed. It's a way that we could induce stress and potentially reduce mildew infection. But again, it's not labeled for this.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest concerns, is that has come up, that you could do chemical mowing of vineyards. We're not recommending it only because that's not, it's unknown, the potential impact longer term. Obviously, if you're using a contact herbicide, the idea would be to burn the canopy off. And what would be the best timing to do that? These are all questions that we don't know, because we're usually worried about producing a good crop, not destroying it. But I want to get to one of the big points about whether the fruit is present or not. A lot of people had asked about trying to remove the fruit and make sure it's gone. I think that shouldn't be the focus. Obviously, you're not concerned about having a crop but you still have to manage the whole plant. And if you remove the crop, the outcome will be, let's say you just go and pinch the clusters. The outcome will be that you have, and pinching the clusters that bloom, you'll have a lot more vegetative vigor, and you'll get a lot of secondary laterals. So laterals that will then have fruit. So you'll have a whole bunch of second crop. The vine is going to want to balance itself out. And we've seen that when we did early season heavy crop thinning around bloom time. That's what happened. We would get tons of laterals, much bushier canopies. And so you're at odds of having to deal with a greater canopy density. So in some regards, having the clusters there and maintaining the crop as best you can would be ideal, rather than just worrying about getting the clusters off the plant. Another question is, if you remove fruit very early, wouldn't the vine just compensate by increasing berry size and clusters that remain? That's true for some varieties. If you cluster thin early, the rest remaining will get bigger. We did not see that happen in Pinot Noir in our studies that we did, but in this case, it could lead to some size compensation in different varieties. But I think most people are looking at this as it's all or nothing sort of thing. They're removing all the crops so that you don't have to worry about it. If you leave the fruit on and you don't harvest it, that's another aspect that came up at the end of last growing season. People were hoping to have a contract and maybe lost the contract last minute, and they decided not to harvest. And there was two scenarios that come up when you don't harvest your fruit that your vines maintained. If they're healthy vines that are highly vigorous, not harvesting your fruit is not going to be a problem. It's not going to put a carbohydrate deficit for the plant. But if you've got weak vines and they've not been harvested, it was recommended, so young vines and weak vines, to cut that fruit off so that you have enough reserve carbohydrate to get you into this next growing season. So that's another thing to keep in mind with all of this, is that the vine, it wants to produce a canopy to support fruit. And that's part of its nature. And once you start altering that, whether you're doing severe hedging or severe leafing or using herbicides to reduce the canopy size, ultimately it will lead to lower fruitfulness of your buds for next year, which maybe that's a good thing for you. But if you're looking at possibly having a market for the next year, marketing your fruit for the next year, some of these practices will put that at odds. So that's where some of these practices that seem a little bit severe to reduce the costs won't be beneficial in the long run if you do want to have marketable fruit within the next year or two. Let's see, I think I see a few more. Some other questions, maybe comments about wine market, the luxury market, and just getting people coming to Oregon for wine tourism, whether the national view of Portland's downturn, is that hindering wine tourism? Do you have any comments to that end? James Stearns.
Yes, I do. My thought is that Oregon, it would be wise not to try to be a second Napa Valley. I think Oregon should be Oregon, and I think Oregon should be true to its brand. And I think there's some particular strengths to that identity. What does it mean? I mean, what people associate with Oregon in terms of pairing wine and wine tourism with all the other things you can do in Oregon in terms of recreational activities. You can't do that in Napa. And I think that there's a lot of positive associations with Portland as well, especially the food culture there. And I think if we're trying to try to keep the pie at least as big as it has been, if not growing the size of that pie, I think working hard to make the most of brand Oregon is in everybody's interest. And that's kind of back to my comment I made earlier about what can the industry do to grow demand? I think authenticity and a lot of other things that are associated with the Pacific Northwest in terms of outdoor recreation and other positive associations are consistent with the demographic that we're most challenged by, the under 35 crowd. So I think there's opportunity there still. It's a slow, long haul. It's not something that's going to save us this season, but I do think it's worth the long-term investment in terms of growing demand, with Oregon being about Oregon and Oregon being on brand about Oregon.
Okay, great. Thanks, James. So I see a few comments and I want to bring them up because I want to just clarify. So if left with unsold fruit, are we of the opinion that the fruit needs to be removed to maintain the health of the vine? So I mentioned this a little bit before. If the fruit is left to ripen on the plant, and if you have a high vigor, and there's no question about the vine vigor, the vines will probably be just fine if that fruit is left on the vine. Might actually balance it out a little bit. But if the vines are moderate to weak in vigor, and depending on the amount of fruit on those vines, it could be a severe limitation. And it depends also on other factors of that site capacity. So I recommend that if you do have fruit that you maintain and you ripen and you just can't sell it, to just take a look at your historical pruning weights, your nutrition data, and really make an informed decision on whether that fruit needs to be dropped to the ground or not, to just save the health of the vineyard. So it's an uneasy, not an easy answer, but just requires going back to some data. Also, another comment, and this is a great comment, that there are ways that you can reduce your production costs that aren't going to decrease your yields or increase them over time. So that's absolutely true. So thinking of ways of putting aside what you typically do and think about ways that, you can do things that you don't need. So, not shoot thinning as much. So I've seen that growers do tend to, at least in cane pruned Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley, shoot thinning has been to the lower end of shoot density, in part to reduce disease, but then also a high amount of spray costs. So maybe weighing the odds, which is more expensive, canopy management or spraying, and making sure you look at those canopies and try to plan for the future accordingly. Also, just looking at transitioning training systems. If you have the space to do so, can you look at training up trunks to do a hanging system, which does cost less, but you need the space to do it. If you're on a high density planting, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And ways to just start training your vineyard in different ways to manage those vineyards in the future. As I wrap up here, I just want to show a couple of sources if you're not already familiar with these. The Oregon Wine Grape Pest Guide. You can scan this code to get access right away. I noticed Jay Scheit is online and provided some good information in the chat about using oils during the growing season and some caveats with that. We have those outlined in our pest management guide. You can look at products that you might want to consider that you maybe haven't used before to try to reduce your production costs. So that's our pest management guide, as well as our Pacific Northwest handbooks. We have one for insect, plant, and plant disease and weeds, and you can get access to all of these online with this code. If you want to scan that and save that URL on your mobile device. And then the third one is that we do have an extension website, and we keep this up to date. We change out the content by season, and we'll put information here. This is the Extension Oregon State Wine Grapes website. You can scan that code and get access. Do use these resources and keep an eye on this one in particular, the Extension website, because if we have resources we can get to you, we'll post them here and to our newsletter. And in the very last moments, as we get wrapped up, I want to give the opportunity to each of the panelists to give one takeaway message that you want to send this group with today. I know we don't have any direct answers for everybody, but one thing that you want people to take away with. So I'm going to start with Alec Levin.
Oh, geez. One takeaway. The decisions that people are going to take are really going to be so case by case. And so I think that we always talk about site-specific management, and I think in this case, it's probably more of a emphasis on that than anything. And someone said something to me that I think is just true and real, is that, money will be lost. The idea is to lose less money than than you can, right? I mean, managing an acre of vineyard is expensive. You're still going to have to put some inputs into it. The idea is to try and figure out where you can lose less money, and to not go like whole hog and do the full management thing. So I don't know if that's inspirational or not, probably not, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, Achala.
Yeah, I think it's more of like understanding your situation. So in terms of diseases, what is the most important to you? So we talked about powdery mildew, botrytis, and like other grapevine diseases such as strong disease, red blotch viruses, and all that. So it's very important to look at the history and like what is the most important disease problems, and any practice that would minimize the pressure for the upcoming years, based on your situation.
Okay, thanks. Walt?
It's gonna be hard. Both for those people that are trying to reduce their inputs, as well as those that are trying to meet contracts. It's just going to be a very difficult year. And for those of you with contracts, there will be no room for error.
James Stearns?
Well, I guess even in down years, as long as you can cover your fixed costs and some of your variable costs, as long as you can cover all your variable costs and some of your fixed costs, you're better off than not doing anything and having all of your fixed costs. So I don't know if I said that clear enough, but if you're playing the long game and you want to stay in this industry, then make sure that you are at least covering all of your variable costs in the coming year and not digging the hole deeper. And hopefully you'll be able to pay off some of your fixed costs along the way. And so at least you're not as worse off, or you're not as bad off as if you didn't do anything, because those fixed costs are still going to be there on that land. So I'd leave it at that as a short-term strategy. But a lot of folks need to be evaluating what are their long-term goals. Is it year-on-year profitability, or is it return on investment over a long period of time? And that's the other thing is what's your horizon? I think that matters for a lot of individual decision making that's coming up this coming year.
Yep. Well said. James Osborne?
Too specific, but I think first, Patty, thank you for putting this all together. And I think that's also kind of my point. I was thinking of continuing this communication and making sure you're sharing, communicating with your neighbors, sharing what's going on in I think continuing that community that we have here in Oregon of doing these things collectively as well, through the ups and downs. I think continuing this conversation, using us as a resource for that, using other resources you have, and sharing with your neighbors and other people that you in this community what's going on and what's working or not working. I think just continually not being too siloed in this, or feeling that this is just your own problem to solve.
Well said, James. I appreciate that comment, because I think that was why we decided to do this. There's a lot of people asking the same questions. We know that research sometimes trails innovation by industry, especially in these hard times. And so if anyone is out there and you want to try something or you just want a second opinion, reach out to any one of us. We're usually all very responsive. Of course, Alec and Achala are in Southern Oregon, and I serve statewide. So does James and Walt. Well, Walt doesn't have an extension appointment, but he's been a fantastic resource. And Jay wasn't on our panel, but he's in attendance. And Jay has always been fantastic. So Jay Scheit, our extension plant pathologist statewide. So reach out if you do have questions. We're just an email away. And we can also possibly even consider doing some trials if you have the space to experiment and you know that you're not going to have the fruit. There might be some field-based trials you could do, and we can help design some of those and what to look for in a year to try to establish some takeaways that we might not otherwise have the opportunity to do. So thank you, everyone. We will be sharing this recording via the OSU Extension YouTube channel once it's available, and we'll sign off for today. So thanks again, everyone.